Okay, great. All right, well, we're back to discuss this section responses to Aporias, and Lacan immediately begins by making a claim that we are going to solve utopia. And so, yeah, buckle up for a very abstract and formalistic seminar session. Wondering if somebody might be willing to kick us off reading, if that's all right, and then I can pick up maybe in the next like page or so.
We need to lay out the nowhere system. Utopia will finally take on meaning thereby, but realized in the right way this time. The old term nullability, which I long ago supplied with the renewed luster it deserves for having been invented by Bishop Wilkins, see a Cree, and which designates the quality of what is nowhere. What is it? It concerns jouissance. What psychoanalytic experience demonstrates is that, owing to a connection with what allows for the emergence of knowledge, jouissance is excluded and the circle closes. This exclusion is enunciated only by the system itself, insofar as it is the symbolic. It thereby asserts itself as the ultimate real of the functioning of the system that excludes it. From nowhere, it returns everywhere, owing to the very exclusion that is the whole of that by which it gets actualized. Our practice focuses on the following. When we deal with symptoms, we must unveil and unmask the relation to jouissance, which is our real because it is excluded. This is why I propose the following three terms as props. Jouissance, insofar as it is excluded, the other, qua locus, where that exclusion is known, and objet a, which is what it is at stake in the matter. Objet a is the scrap, or leftover, shoot, that results from the fact that in the play of the signifier, it is jouissance that is nevertheless aimed at. The subject, who, because he has received from where, the signifier qua means, has emerged from the unsayable relationship to jouissance, is thereby struck by relationship to what assumes the form of the other from that point on, avatars of which arise, it still being operative, and this is clearly what draws our attention. These are the terms with which we must situate psychoanalysis. Right from its very origin, it is the, as it were, wild experience thereof. Born undoubtedly in an exceptional flash, thanks to Freud, psychoanalysis has never stopped being at the mercy of the diversions available along its route, which are identical to the ones in the network in which the subject it deals with is caught up. Should I continue or?
Yeah, no, that's good. I wonder if there's any thoughts or questions, but I mean, I think the first point is that nullability is a sort of programming concept that is, I don't know much about it. Perhaps others might know more, but its basic point is that it is, as it might imply, something which produces a null or a sort of non-value. So that is the real of jouissance that he's getting at, and he's using this concept to describe that, how that exception then links back into well, the symbolic or the system of signification, I guess. And all of that's clear enough. Obviously, he's making this move to isolate these three nodal concepts in some sense. So we'll see where he goes with that. But I think otherwise it's fairly clear. It's kind of picking up from last time about this notion of the point of exception. Yes, actually.
I think the other connection was also, and I don't know why I keep going back to it, but scientific socialism in this sort of like utopia is the place of desire, but this time we're going to realize it in the right way, like not just we won't just imagine a place somewhere else where it happens, but like and that theme seems to be connected to this, like if fascism is a kind of idealization, like the revolutionary movement sort of, is de-idealized. So it's like the real movement rather than this like So I don't know. I mean, there seemed to be like this connection between the political kind of yeah, I don't know if that's clear, but yeah, I think I sort of saw that.
Yeah, I mean, this is compelling. This notion of the Lacanian conception of lack and this notion of the jouissance of the exception tied into this conception of utopia as a as a territory of nowhere, psychic territory of nowhere. I mean, yeah, we can talk about that too. I've been doing a lot of work on utopia myself from Ernst Bloch's Principle of Hope. And it is very interesting because I've been in debate with this Hegelian Jensen Suter who thinks that, you know, Lacan's conception of an ontology based on lack is actually, you could say, sort of anathema to, uh, well, maybe the Hegelian tradition of thinking utopia in some sense. That's his claim. Um, like, anyways, it goes back to that same precise point, by the way, of the assault on Lucien Goldman, because Lucien Goldman says that Kant's political community allows the group psychology, right, to locate the we. So, anyways, it's a very ambitious thing Lacan is doing here, because I think that he's getting at the heart of this Marxist conception of utopia, maybe. Go ahead, Matilda.
Yes, on this subject, this like series of lessons that we're in starts off with thought of censorship, I believe, and that is where utopia is kind of developed pretty, I mean, so it's like we're at the beginning and the end of the group of lessons, and I think he's returning to this theme, and back then it was like thought and like what is the relationship of freedom to thought? And he says like with Plato and with like the people who are thinking about like the ideal, like that somehow they're assuming that there is like freedom in thought or something. However, Lacan proposes that their knowledge of what they're developing remains imaginary, and that freedom for Lacan, its relationship to thought is much different and based on the norm and the exception. That freedom for Lacan only is arrived after the subject is presented with the norm from the outside, and the concept, the notion of freedom arises with the foregrounding of the notion of the norm as like a correlated exception to the norm.
Very helpful. That's extremely helpful. Thank you for that. No, you're totally right to remind us. Yeah, because, you know, Lacan is not a charitable like educator, right? He's a provocateur. So he's very rarely going to be explicit regarding the, like, you know, the true sort of source of his of his critique that's going on under the surface in some ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very elusive.
Sure, and it just struck me that maybe the norm is related to the ego ideal and the marks developing for the subject. Like the subject comes into language, it comes into the marks, the signifiers. It develops the ego ideal, almost externally is brought to them. Anyway, that was just a second thought I had.
Okay, great. Luis, please.
Yeah, so I think we need to read this new session following the previous one, right? So the previous one is knowledge and jouissance, right? So this is exactly how he's like kind of starts right now, because he's having these three different concepts: jouissance, as that what is excluded; the other, the locus where jouissance is known, right? So here it comes the duality of jouissance and knowledge, right? And the object A as what is at stake, what is at the subject matter, right? Because if we follow what the previous session, it is it's exactly what we have been talking about the ideal ego, right? And how the symbolic identification creates a gap in this ideal ego, right? So there is not a match between knowledge and jouissance, right? And there is a conflict about accepting the fact that God doesn't, if God believes in himself, right? If the norm contains itself, like the Platonic ideal, right? So that will be something different when we think about utopia, right? As Matilde was talking about, because when Plato talks about the ideas, right? I mean, he comes to the Parmenides, and he doubts himself about if an idea can contain itself, right? So again, and then he writes about his book about what is his books, the rules, the norm. What is the name of his last book about the rules of this ideal society? What is the name?
The laws. Is it the
The
laws?
laws, yeah, the laws
Yeah.
of this ideal society. So
Yeah.
maybe we I haven't read that book, but
Yeah.
maybe we should compare that to that book, right? Not to the previous one, The Republic, where there is this idea of self-contained thoughts, right? Self-contained ideal thoughts, right?
Right. Very helpful framing and context. Thank you, as always. Connor, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to say quickly, like, it seems as though, like, already the move that I'm anticipating, just reading just like this short introduction, is like, how is it that our commitment to the other, which indeed creates the circle and situates us within the circle, actually results in us being found nowhere? Like, how does that commitment to the other, and indeed the other is like the guarantor of knowledge, the emergence of knowledge and our relationship to knowledge, etc. How is it that our commitments to that actually going to disorient us, right? And lead us into something that is that utopia? I think that's sort of like what is being introduced already, what I'm picking up. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, it's a very strange way of construing utopia, if we are honest, right? Because it's not grounded in a theory of consciousness. It's not grounded in a substantialist identification to a community ideal, right? It's something else from that. But those are the flagship means. I mean, like, I'll just give you an example of Ernst Bloch's critique of Freud. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it in his conception of utopia, which is that psychoanalysts reflect the bourgeois class consciousness, class position of pessimism and despair in such a way that they can only conceive of the psychic, like, reality of subjectivity vis-a-vis the unconscious. And he says that this is like a fundamentally anti-utopian proposition, and that's why he develops this thing called the not yet conscious. But then he says the not yet conscious basically refers to this kind of he then has to develop almost like an empirical historical materialist account of its appearance in history. And then he then goes back and gives these case studies of how certain slogans, certain images certain identifications with a future-oriented consciousness, which then permits utopia to occur, allows utopian thought to mobilize, right? But then he basically says a very interesting thing, which is basically like, whatever, technological modernity has brought home this, has evacuated this form of consciousness. And that's why it has become transposed into the field of like culture and aesthetics, right? So anyways, okay. Akshay, please, you had your hand.
I had a very short note. I mean, I guess like I mean, just with regards to what Connor was saying, like I mean, this knowledge being in the other, I think it goes back to this like very basic thing of like anaclitic or anaclysis or by language. I mean, in so much as like insofar if I say a sentence, I don't know what it means or my knowledge about what it means doesn't matter. You will tell me what it meant. Or like no one knows, right? Only grammar, which is outside all of us. But I mean, it does feel a bit like, sorry, what am I saying? Lacan is just like taking Hegel and then like reading Hegel through Klein, almost like introjection and projection, and like all of these ideas of inside, outside, and what Matilda was saying earlier about like for Plato, some of these things are outside, but then what this once you have this sort of Kantian idea of the subject and say capitalism, there's a different orientation of what's inside and what's outside. And he's trying to sort of recover this dimension of he's kind of critiquing this idea that it's all in your head. And he's kind of recovering like, no, actually all of politics is like within the field of transference because it's all sort of invested by libido. There's nowhere sort of that's not in your head that they kind of.
Extremely insightful. Thank you all. Would somebody care to read this really interesting section about the Belle Epoque? I love this section. Perhaps
I
somebody
can read
might.
it.
Please.
I enjoy this section, so I would like to begin with something as close to home as possible. Here's an object or device that I especially like. You can lecture me about it as you like, from an analytic standpoint, please, or some other standpoint. It doesn't much matter. It's a pen. It is similar as possible to a feather pen in the old antediluvian sense, because it is so slim. Very few people use them nowadays, as it can be closed, becoming something that fits in the palm of your hand. It holds very little ink. The upshot being that it is difficult to refill because osmic effect occur, which are such that when one pours a drop of ink in it, the drop is exactly the same size as the opening. It is thus quite inconvenient. Still, I am quite attached to it because it constitutes a certain type of nib with a real feather. Indeed, it dates back to a time when people really used feathers, not the rigid device they use today. This feather pen was given to me by someone who knew I was looking for this sort of thing. The gift was sent just a few minutes or just a few hours or days, it doesn't really matter, before I received it, by someone who was certainly paying homage to me in a very precise, in short, fetishistic way. It was, moreover, an object which, as the giver told me, the person who handed it to me came from the gift giver's grandmother. That explains why it is not easy to find another one like it. There are apparently shops in New York where people sell pens from the Belle Epoque, beginning of the 20th century. I acquire mine, as you see, through a different channel. I thus have a glimpse into the history of this object. It is dear to me. It is dear to me for its own sake, quite independently of its history. For to tell you the truth, I am not especially grateful to the person who gave me this present. My relation to this object is based on the fact that it is certainly very close to what for me constitutes object A. I thus have a glimpse into the history of the object, but don't you see, owing to the way I just brought it alive, that the history of an object is just as open to question as the history of a subject is? Okay. Shall I continue?
Yeah, please, definitely.
Yeah, okay. How can we imagine who it is that knows that history and can answer for it, unless we establish the other as the locus where it is known? And assuming we have begun to grasp this dimension, how can we avoid realizing that the dimension exists, at least for certain people, and I dare say for each of us? For certain people, it is altogether predominant, but it constitutes a backdrop for all of us. There is somewhere where everything that has happening is known. As soon as we began to invest in this vein, we recognize that the signifier of a whole is always implicit, and that it is far from implicit in the obsessive neurotic than to others. It is via history, insofar as it is suggested, not to all directly on the basis of the subject, but on the basis of the fate of objects, that we realize how crazy it is to presume any sort of locus in which it is known. It is known in the neutral sense in which I just introduced it, immediately veers towards an interesting question. Does the locus where it is known know itself? Its reflexivity only arises from consciousness owing to the very detour which must be verified if, where we assume it is known that it is known. Okay. It is assuming to note, for instance, that mathematicians, when they do mathematical work, are well aware that they are doing so, but are utterly unable to say what allows them to determine it. They haven't said a word about it thus far. They can say what mathematical work is, but not what it is. They can say what mathematical work is not. I'm sorry, what mathematical work is not, but not what it is. Okay. Yet what a mathematician with whom I was speaking about this quite recently told me that what characterizes a mathematical claim is its independence from its context. A theorem can be stated and justified all by itself because it is sufficiently self-contained. This frees it from the discourse that presents it, unlike what we see in other discourses, where if we quote a part of it, we risk taking it out of context. We have here, perhaps, a first step along the path to be followed, which consists in following things that are said in such a way that they know themselves at every moment and can attest to it. We should look into this closely. Indeed, the subsistence of the instantaneous, it knows itself, as such, is accompanied by the fact that it assumes that everything that attains this is also known, in the sense in which it overlaps itself. It knows itself as a whole. Now, what is revealing here is that what is presumed to be a discourse that aspires to completely intersect itself encounters limits insofar as there are points that cannot be posited in it. Okay. Should I continue?
So this is good. Yeah, let's see if there's any discussion. So here we have the breakdown of a nice example of an object from the past, which Lacan identifies as an object A for himself, which I was thinking like what that might be for us. And I was thinking of the example of like a like pre-digital music player. If we were to like, you know, those Walkmans that played CDs, right? I don't know, like some of you guys are young, you don't even have CDs, but like that was very interesting because it was like this object that we got all kinds of pleasure out of, and then to resurrect it as a completely irrelevant object, we would forget the I don't know, like we in some ways we might forget the basis by which that object allowed us to derive pleasure within a discourse, within a world, and so on. And I think that's kind of what Lacan means in some sense. Sort of, it's similar to the example that he uses in the ethics seminar of sublimation of objects, right? Through the notion of the matchbook. Like the matchbook is a ordinary mundane object that you can find at a dive bar, but then it takes on this really strange, uncanny quality that he uses as a metaphor for sublimation when you like put it up on the wall as if it is framed to be something significant. It's still a mundane object, but the fact that you've put it up on the wall somehow signifies it in relationship to like large A. You then kind of impute onto the object some kind of coherence, some kind of totality has to be presumed. You see my point? That's the definition of sublimation, of the elevation of an ordinary object to the dignity of a thing. And so here I think it's similar. But then, of course, the Lacanian twist is that the universe by which we invest in the enjoyment of these objects, whether it be like the old fountain pen that all the great writers and poets used to write with, you know, um, which we have no grasp regarding what it must have taken to be creative in those conditions. Like, you know what I mean? We have no grasp on the large A of that universe. We could only presume to it. So it's interesting that Lacan says that because he's born at a time in which some people still did that, maybe. So I don't know. Those are my thoughts on it. I don't know, Connor.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So two things, first of all, that need to be said. Uh, Aaron has a Walkman with the CD. That's so awesome. But when you were talking about something else that came to mind, just like vinyl players, you know, the increasing fetishization of like playing vinyl, you know, people just becoming Luddites and stuff. But I think what Lacan is talking about here is a distinction between gifts and commodities, because this pen was given to him as a gift. And, you know, he does mention in passing that people in New York City can buy similar sorts of pens. So what is he's making a distinction then between these two sorts of objects, which appear to be the same, but they are not, right? And so how does the gift appear to him as opposed to the commodity? And yeah, the gift, you know, because it is a gift and I don't know, it's more personal, it's imbued with more history, right? But even like so I think he's like doing this, and it's along those lines then that I read this paragraph. It's via history insofar as it is suggested, not at all directly on the basis of the subjects, but on the basis of the fate of the objects. And, you know, I can continue to read this whole paragraph, but I think what he's getting at there is just commodity fetishism, you know, even though he doesn't use the word, right? Because what he's talking about is, I mean, what is commodity fetishism, right? Like understanding the world as objects relating to one another rather than understanding the world through how it is that subjects relate to one another, right?
Yeah,
So,
totally. Yeah, totally. It's kind of like I have an object right behind me, which is a periscope from the First World War of my great grandfather. And I was thinking to myself, could I ever use this object on a vacation? in some innocent way to like bird watch? And of course, the answer is no way. You know what I mean? And that's a good example of the lack of comportment to my A world with a capital A. Like that object has no comportment to my world.
Right. Like, and we're
You
just
know what I mean?
the fate of the object world for we're getting invested in that when we should be invested in the fate of our own worlds through our own activity. Right.
Well, yeah, it's
So
also very similar to this Heideggerian notion that Lacan will develop regarding the theory of the object next year in seminar 17, of these like ephemeral technological objects. And Lacan famously makes a very, very funny like prophecy about how of podcasting, basically. He's like, my speech will one day be reduced to commodification because all of these people are recording him talk. And then he says pretty soon they're going to pass around the tape. Have you heard Lacan here? Have you heard Lacan there? And so on and so forth. So you're totally right. I think it has to do with this idea of and yeah, and Heidegger is a big part, I think, going on here in terms of the ontology of the object that he's developing. Okay, let's go to Luis.
I find it interesting that although he likes the pen, he says, I'm not especially grateful to the person who gave me this present, right? And that's the, the moving, I don't know, piece that it changes the topic, right? I mean, why wouldn't he be, and he will be ungrateful, right? And I think it comes back to this history, the fact that the object is from the Belle Epoque, right? So it belongs to his culture, right? But it was bought in New York. It was bought without history, right? So it is so close to his history, but at the same time, it doesn't have history to him, right? It was a gift that, as a commodity that has no history at all, right? So I think this is why, it is so sacred, but it has been also desacralized, right? And I think that's why he then talks about mathematics and how there is nonsense to talk about context in mathematics, right? You mathematicians think that the mathematical ideas are self-contained, right? Which wouldn't be which forecloses history, right? And in which the pen, the object as object A will need, right? It needs a history to have a context in which we can understand that object, right? So yeah, that was my interpretation about why he disliked this person, right?
Excellent. Yes, Akshay, please.
No, I think everyone's saying very interesting things. And just to kind of add to that, I mean, I guess one's comment of universe is like either as God, like for example, this position of is there a place where sort of knowledge knows itself, and therefore is knowledge sort of organized by God? Is there something that assures it? But like by the time you get to Kant, it isn't. The universe itself is not organized. It's only subjective reason in the fact that that's how subjectivity is ordered, organizes it. And to go back to sort of Plato, I mean, sort of in the Phaedrus, there's this, interesting bit where writing is sort of considered evil because it allows for like the anaclysis or deterritorialization of thought, insofar as it can allow it for something to be taken to another context where it's interpreted differently. And part of what's horrifying about this Kantian image is, oh, you're telling me there's no single signifier God that assures the universe of a communication. It's just subjects speaking to each other, having to construct their own truths. That's not. So I don't know. I mean, I just found that sort of. I forgot what I was going to say after that, but And the last thing is, I mean, actually, the one person, I mean, Benjamin actually writes a lot about this. In the Arcades project, there's like this one really nice section called the curator, where he's talking about like the collection of objects that a curator collects, and they have no meaning outside of the subjectivity of the curator, right? Like there is no, and for him, it's like this fundamentally modernist, like you can collect anything, you know, maps, stamps, anything can become sort of invested as an object of attention, sorry. And this curator sort of like stuffs his or her house with these like, you know, but it's already a kind of like very much, I mean, another paper where he sort of talks about this, Benjamin, is the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, where he says like, with mechanical reproducibility, something really fundamental happens to art itself, like, you know, like, which in an earlier mode, you know. So I don't know, I mean, I think you guys are all saying very, very interesting things. And I'm sorry for rambling.
Yeah, there's like that whole loss of aura that's associated with mass produced objects and commodities that I find very interesting. And yeah, I think that whole idea of like you know, like junk collectors, like my uncle is a junk collector of war memorabilia, and so he has no discrimination. And so it's very weird that it's just like, oh, wait a second, you have memorabilia from very, very evil regimes in history, stretching back to like ancient Japanese war and the Revolutionary War. And like, so you see my point. It's very interesting because like in the recent times, things have gotten obviously like you have things like 1619 Project, and you have like a new kind of hyper liberal politicization of history. And my cousins have told my uncle that he has to get rid of all of his uh, evil memorabilia. But again, he had no, like, he was just purely like, I take all war memorabilia. But it's interesting how it came to signify something different for them in this epoch, in this moment. Go ahead, Matilda.
I'd like to emphasize that he says that the history of an object is just as open to the question as the history of the subject is. And it looks like we're kind of developing like the history of the object in this chapter. Whereas I think the history of the subject might be something closer to like Hegel or something, where he says something along the lines that like, for Hegel, the illusion is that I am where I am thinking. It's like the failure of self-certainty. And like it will, and then this is a quote, it will take time in the course of history, for Hegel, in the end to think in the right place, in the place where I will have become knowledge. So there's this question of the history of like thinking that there is a place where maybe like the subject is collected in a certain way that is an illusion. Yeah.
100%. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we're speaking about a thinker who advocates in his late years for the dissolution of his institution. And that's interesting. I think you're right that there's something highly compelling in what Lacan is doing regarding the topology of the realization of subjectivity, even the name that Lacan gives to the achievement of subjectivity at the end of analysis is, of course, subjective destitution. Right? So, yeah, this is something for us to flag. Go ahead, Luis.
A comment about this memorabilia. I have a friend that collects coins with his father, and there is a name for the people that collect coins, but I forgot. Pneumatics, something like that. Anyways, these people they collect coins in a very special way. They have like a album they get an album where they have all the coins in the world, right? And it becomes like an inventory, right? So they get so many coins that they don't even appreciate the coins itself. It is more about an inventory, and the coins themselves just become, they play between this emptiness and presence of, oh, I'm missing this coin, right? So I need to have this coin to fill my inventory of the coins, right? So it's not it degrades the object, right? And of course it also forecloses the history of the object. It just becomes
Yeah.
another object in an inventory, right?
Exactly. That was the problem that I had with my uncle's war collection. There was no proper, like, okay, yeah, you have a Nazi flag. And I know that you have no ideological sympathy with that. But there was something about it that was, yeah, too sanitizing or too neutralizing regarding the whole thing. And it was uncanny that he used to look at all of that like neutrally, like, oh yeah, that's just whatever happened. That's very weird. Okay, let's get back to this. Where did we leave off exactly? On the top of 286? Is that right? The
Yeah.
first image? Is that
Yeah.
right?
I
Okay,
can finish this part.
please.
Okay. The first image of this is provided by the infinite series of whole numbers, where the number that is defined as being larger than any number cannot be positive. It is impossible to write a number that is greater than every other. Such a number is excluded, specifically qua symbol. It is owing to the impossibility of writing it that the entire series of whole numbers turns out not to be the simple written trace of something that can be written, but something that is in the real. The real arises from this very impossibility. It is this very mechanism that allows us to return to this sign, which cannot be posited in terms of the series of whole numbers. In other words, at the level of symbols. In order to posit it by writing it as a transinfinite number, Aleph, we can then begin to explore what can happen by using this sign or symbol. We know that it allows us, in fact, to handle in a new symbolic way relations that are dismissible in series of whole numbers, which constitute its reality. Not all of them can be taken up anew in this way, but some of them certainly can. This can lead to progress that is still ongoing in mathematical discourse, which, while knowing itself at every moment, never fails to encounter a combination of limits which withholds known as infinite numbers. In other words, unfathomables, until we are able to reduce them to limits of by taking them up in a different structure. An aporia here is never anything but the encounter with some facet of the other structure. We see this quite clearly in set theory, in which we can in fact innocently make headway for a while. It especially interests us because at the more radical level with which we deal, that of the impact of a signifier in repetition, nothing apparently objects to the fact that A is the complete inscription of all possible histories. Every signifier refers all the more to the other as it can refer to itself only qua other, which means that nothing stops signifiers from being distributed in a circular manner. It is what allows us to clearly state that there is a set of everything that is not identical to itself. It is perfectly conceivable that things are organized in such a way as to go around in a circle. Even the catalog of all catalogs that don't include themselves. It is perfectly admissible to the sole condition that we know that no catalog contains itself, apart from its title. This doesn't stop the set of all catalogs from having the closed characteristic that each catalog, insofar as it does not include itself, can always be inscribed in another catalog that it itself includes. If we draw the directed network of these things, the only one that is excluded is the circular path, which implies that B refers to itself. It suffices that B refers to C and that C refers back to B for there to be no obstacle to the correlative subsistence of B and C, or to them both being included in some larger whole. And there is the graphs of BC to BDCF. Yeah.
Okay, very good, very good. Let's I can pick up reading now if that's helpful, and we can revisit figure 21.1. It's funny that we've gone through 21 figures, graphs, diagrams, etc. over these past several months. Each one has been very interesting. So yeah, let's get back to this. It's not immediately evident the logic, but yeah, Matilda, jump in and then we will go back to the reading.
Yes, quickly. I think what I'm seeing here is we're taking mathematics as the paradigm of knowledge. We're leaving that realm of ideality. I suppose the imaginary, we're working with axioms and mathematics. He relates that to Freud a few lessons ago. And I think the question is like, can we create like the question is like the subsistence of the instantaneous, it knows itself. In the sense it overlaps with itself, it knows itself as a whole. Like it seems like mathematics at every moment kind of has a sense of itself. And the first image of what he's trying to bring up here is like when we're talking about the natural numbers, when we're talking about the infinite series of the whole, I'm sorry, of the whole numbers, there comes to be a point where like we can't write that number, but such a such a number is excluded as a symbol and therefore can be used and manipulated. And furthermore, or likewise, in a similar way, that in relationship with, he says at a more radical level, if we take that as an analogy, we can also say that perhaps A, as the collection of all possible histories, is excluded as it's excluded and it can be operated with as a symbol, but never as itself. We can't write perhaps all of the things in the collection, but we can exclude it and operate with that A as a symbol. And that this is that A, the structure of A is the Russell paradox here, or something like that. I'm sorry, and that this A has the property that of these pathways, it can never be the first one where it's self-referential, and that maybe we should be thinking about Freud's schematic of the neurons and how those function, where Lacan relates them to language rather than biological things.
Excellent, Matilda. I think you've nailed it. I really think you got it. Especially on this point of why A is not included there or large A is not included. That's a very brilliant observation. So yeah, kudos on that. That's very helpful framing. Akshay, please. Or sorry, Luis, then Akshay.
Yeah, what I found interesting is that Lacan, and he says, it is perfectly admissible on the sole condition that we know that no catalog contains itself apart from its title, right? So I think this is crucial because Lacan is kind of saying that, and this is something that he discussed in seminar 14, and that again talking about the Russell paradox. There, and he talks about books that contains all the books, and he says you cannot describe the book that contains all the books, but you can write it up, right? So you can symbolize it, but that it cannot self-explain itself, right? So there's a difference. You can symbolize it. That's why it says you can have the title, like the book of all books. But now what that means, right? The other, right? It cannot, you cannot, it cannot self-reference itself if it's not by another, right? That's why I think the first graph is the B that goes back to itself, but it's only because it's just a title, it's just a sign, right? But then what it means, a knowledge can only be expressed with another proposition, right? Like a C, right? So I think that is something that is implicit, but not really explicit in what he's saying right now.
Excellent. Yes, Akshay, please.
There's an interesting kind of double reference here, which, and I think Daniel will probably be able to say more about this in the sense that, I mean, like what everyone else was saying also just struck me, like from a very practical perspective, like if we think about Nietzsche and like history, or like all of these guys, like for Foucault and everyone, it's like, well, of course, history is originally the history of the rulers, and like then like the introduction of a kind of like critical history, like I mean from a very practical perspective, like when you're talking about there is no meta language, like obviously all rulers I mean sorry I just what I meant to say is like in addition to this logical side, there seems like a very kind of practical argument about like concretely speaking where is history, like and like if someone claims to know history, like is there a sort of obfuscation of a power relation that uh and a lot of like say like critical modern consciousness would be this kind of like uh a sort of critical perspective towards the sources that reading against the grain. I mean, and to go back to sort of signifier as opposed to trace, because when you're reading against the grain, you're like, oh, you're saying certain things, but I can read in that certain traces and I can see what you're not saying, right? So there's something in your speech that's excluded. And I include that because I feel that that's part of the picture. I mean, yeah, but I mean, I guess you know a lot more about. I've never read Nietzsche, so I have no idea. So, but
Yeah, that's very compelling. No, that's very compelling. I mean, this idea of the unknowability of history is obviously in the history of Western thought predates Nietzsche, but it is very unique to a certain direction of Kantianism, right? With this notion of the unknowability of the thing in itself. So it's yeah, it reminds me of Lacan's first poem that he wrote, which he entitled Hiatus Irrationalis, which is the irrational point, which you may remember in my interview with Dominique Hones, he connected that to Lacan's interest in Fibonacci. And now we have this notion of the origin of the natural number from the point of infinity. And I think the interesting point about this origin of the natural number and infinity is sort of what in psychoanalysis, in the exchange of analyst and analysand, stands for that, right? Is it in fact the symptom that stands for this point of that which is excluded, but which can only be given a sign, maybe. Let us continue. The point at infinity. Okay, what psychoanalytic experience does is detect somewhere the point at infinity, also known in mathematics as the ideal point of everything that's organized in the realm of signifying combinations. This point at infinity is irreducible insofar as it concerns a certain jouissance that is left problematic, insofar as it raises the question of jouissance in a way that's no longer outside the system of knowledge. I see. I see. So the point at infinity permits us to locate jouissance back into the system. Okay. The signifier of jouissance, a signifier that is excluded in as much as it is the one we promote, calling it the, quote, phallic signifier, end quote, is that around which all the biographies to which psychoanalytic literature tends to reduce neurosis revolve. This is a good point. Like this whole Burglar's thesis on Herman Melville, right? Which is that Ahab in Moby Dick stands for uh, the impassable traumatic point of incest from which his familial past was repressed. And that then the second work that Melville wrote pinpoints that object with much more precision. It's called Pierre and the Ambiguities. Yeah. And then the irony is, of course, is that that book nobody liked, but that first one, the Moby Dick, everybody obviously loved. But the object, the ideal point in is obscure, is the point of Burglar, by the way. I think that's what this means, right? Okay. Indeed, once an analyst becomes accustomed to this, he begins to take for granted the strained infantile relations that develop between a subject and a certain number of terms, father, mother, and a baby brother or sister. And he, the analyst, considers them to be the earliest terms, even though they only take on meaning and weight owing to the place they occupy in the links between knowledge, jouissance, and a certain object. Those are the three that we talked about before. So those terms only take on weight, not in some historical scene or primal scene and so on. That's, I think, a very Lacanian point. Yeah, they're bound up in the speech. They live in the present in some sense, right? That at least is how I am formulating it today. I shall perhaps formulate it more elaborately hereafter, at least I hope so. It is not enough to take a step back from the current quote unquote interpersonal relations, as they're called. That someone whom we call an adult, an adult who is, I must say, necessarily adulterated. I'm sure Lacan is like smoking a cigar as he says this, and people are laughing. Comes to confide in us about and to point out a simple homology, even if it is as complete as possible between them and his earliest relationships. The latter must all be situated with respect to these three terms whose presence, weight, and insistence. He's talking about an analyst and talking about their childhood, right? Right. The latter must all be situated with respect to these three terms whose presence, weight, and insistence in the course of the analysis we convey, whether we like it or not, and whether we know it or not, by the way in which we understand the second or rather first biography said to concern childhood. We say that it is the earliest, but often it is there merely to mask the question we really have to explore. What determines it? Its sole mainspring is always, of course, found in the way in which the father's and mother's desires presented themselves. In other words, the way in which they in fact offered knowledge, jouissance, and object A to their child. We could also apply this to the graph of desire, of course, as well, because these three terms appear there very clearly, right? This is what must consequently incite us to not merely explore the subject's history, but the way in which each of these terms was offered to him. Therein lies what we improperly call, quote, the choice of neurosis, unquote, or even the choice between psychosis and neurosis. There was no choice, for the choice was already made at the level of what was presented to the subject. But that can only be located and perceived as a function of the three terms I've just tried to bring out for you. Their import is not singular, and part of it is historical. We must indicate what psychoanalysis signifies in history, where certain choices were offered to it. 2, relations between knowledge and jouissance considered on a community-wide scale, not being the same in our times as in antiquity, for example. Could anyone possibly believe our position is akin to the Epicureans or another such school? Actually, some people have argued that, by the way. I think it's valid to do so in part because Lacan flirts with utilitarianism, you know? So it is feasible. And even that book on Deleuze and pleasure situates Lacan in some of these genealogies. So it is possible, actually. A certain retreat from or suspension of jouissance was possible for them. Okay. In a way that was in some sense innocent, whereas owing to the emergence of what we call capitalism, we are all included in the relation to jouissance in a way that is characterized by the ridgeline of its purity, as it were. Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point, right? Which is the market of desire, right? The knowledge market and the what he calls earlier in this seminar, the apparatus of enjoyment is itself inescapable. And it is so inescapable that that apparatus has disabled, if you like, the possibility of revolting against capitalism itself, right? Which is why in television, Lacan basically says, only a saint could rebel against capitalism. Because I think the point that he's making here, as I read it, would be that the Epicureans are basically ascetics. They had an outside. They had an outside, and the market was not dominating in instrumentalizing enjoyment. Okay. Anyways, now he's getting into exploitation of workers, and he's going to make us very upset. Are we ready for this? Matilda, do you want to make a comment?
Yeah, just real quick. The ideal point is also a term that's used in perspective art. It's the point on the horizon at which like the projective, like the scene is developed. And it's like, you know, this sense of like this excluded term, this ideal point on the horizon is the term by which biographies are filled out, are kind of like normal understanding of human history, like, you know, like perspective painting kind of came into existence in like the, you know, the Renaissance or something. Maybe there's something like this sense of like the exclusion of jouissance as being determining in this way is like emergent. I'm thinking about how antiquity is different than now, and what could be at stake in the exclusion of jouissance from work. Like it becomes a problem for us all. We all orient ourselves now with regard to this ideal point or exclusion of jouissance. That creates a coherence to our stories and creates like almost a universality of experience, perhaps. I don't know.
You're muted, Daniel.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, you're kind of theorizing that vis-a-vis like the capitalist discourse in some ways. I think that's very interesting. Connor, please.
Yeah, I think I agree with Matilda. Like I think the departure point from Epicureans in antiquity is basically um one from basically locality to the universality of capitalism. I think that's kind of what's going on there in part. But yeah, um I guess I just want to stress how important like this part is. Like therein lies what we improperly call the choice of neuroses, or even the choice between psychosis and neuroses. There was no choice, for the choice was already made at the level of what was presented to the subject, but that can only be located and perceived as a function of the three terms, which are altogether the phallic signifier. So what's really like going on here is that like what sorts of possibilities are presented to you,
Mm.
right? Like and how that forms and constitutes like your subjectivity. What determines your subjectivity. And yeah, like the thing is like in capitalism, like there are only so many possibilities offered to you, right? And one of them is uh the choice of whether or not you're going to work or not, and the conditions of your work and so on, right? So, yeah, I certainly think all of those things are uh, in the stew, have to be, we should be thinking of, right?
Yeah, no, it's good because I think it also returns us even a bit to tragedy, which you talked about last time, and the tragic position of the neurotic and choice, but also even to Antigone and to Pascal, great figures of the decision, right? So in that sense, uh uh yeah, a lot has been written regarding Lacan's conception uh, of choice and false choice, which we can like, the Renata Salakol, I think is how you pronounce her name, has written some of very, very interesting work in this regard. Yes, Luis, and then we will go back.
So I have been reading Lacan talks about Stoic logic, and he says how the Stoic logic is embodied, right? So I don't know much, but just that. But I think we can make a comparison between, nowadays it's very popular Stoicism in this very market-oriented perspective, right? And I wonder if we can see there, um, capitalism's, own interpretation, right, of Stoicism and Epicureanism. Yeah, we can add that too, right? As because I mean, if you see those people, they give you these whole guidelines of how you should behave and all that, right? And when Stoicism is we focus about ethics, but there was also, logic. There was also physics, right? That try to make you a wise person, right? So it was not just about following rules like today, right? So in a very
Yeah.
control way to, it's not about you controlling your jouissance, right? Your pleasure, but following some other's perspective of how you should control your pleasure, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That and also the Epicurean impulse presupposes a harmonious striving or yearning, even at probably at the level of desire of their theory of this subject, which would be that the task of human ethics and therefore of human flourishing is to come into touch with a pure enjoyment. And late capitalism has revealed that like there is no homeostasis regarding the distribution of enjoyment. Okay. All right, let's continue. What is known as the quote exploitation of workers very precisely involves the fact that enjoyment, being excluded from work, provides them by dint of that very fact, and in the same way I mentioned earlier regarding the point at infinity, with their entire reality. This is what brings on this sort of aporia that's suggested by the new meaning, which was absent from its ancient context, and is without precedent acquired by the word revolution, quote unquote, with regard to the domination of society. Okay, so if enjoyment's excluded from work, this provides the worker with the basis of their entire reality. And that then brings out the aporia in the word revolution. So yeah, like that's the basic parameters of the 68 conundrum, right? Which is, yeah, how does the dissatisfaction born from work, how is it that that dissatisfaction cannot serve as the locus of the generation of coherent group logic for the advocacy of revolution? Why is that not working? This something about enjoyment at a collective level is tripping it up. We have something to say about this. First of all, to recall to mind the close circular tie between this word, revolution, and the system that brings it to us, the capitalist system. Marx saw this quite clearly, and it is even the only thing that he articulated that has thus far proven to be effective. Aha, see, now he's a good political Marxist. I like this. But we as analysts perhaps also have something to propose regarding this. We could point with a series of examples to a seam of interest. I mean, of historical interest. We could quite miserably fail to do so. If we examine the turning point that biographically constitutes the moment at which a neurosis is born, we see a choice being offered in a way that is all the more insistent in that it is itself what is determinate at that turning point. The choice is between what is rendered present, namely the point of impossibility or point at infinity that always enters the picture when one first encounters sexuality, and its correlate, which is the projection of this impossibility onto inadequacy stemming from the fact that it arises in childhood prior to puberty. But how could this time not always be premature with regard to impossibility? This impossibility is masked by inadequacy and diverted from having to be executed, because the subject is not necessarily up to it, qua living being when left to its own devices. So this is kind of like, I'm thinking here of the mirror stage. I'm thinking of the subjectivity of the process of Oedipus itself, which is reliant on the nodal points of paternal others for transitioning out of what Lacan is calling inadequacy, right? Okay. The alibi that is based on the impossibility in inadequacy is also a detour, as I called it earlier, that psychoanalysis can take. After all, humanly speaking, we cannot fail to sense that we are ministers of succor and may, at one point or another, with one person or another, have the opportunity to do something beneficial. Nevertheless, that is not what justifies psychoanalysis, nor is it where psychoanalysis comes from or where its meaning lies. This is so for a simple reason, which is that it is not what the neurotic attests to. Okay. So the neurotic, therefore, does not attest to the point at infinity that was articulated up above in this section that I'm highlighting here, which has to do with the birth of impossibility, having to do with the intrusion of sexual jouissance at a stage in which the child, I guess you could say, is not prepared for it. And that this leaves a lasting trauma, right? But that lasting trauma is not, can be the site for the intervention of an analyst. But Lacan says this is actually not how neurosis should be treated. Now, I think what I don't understand as much, and I'd like others to maybe jump in here, is sort of who within the psychoanalytic field is sort of, advocating this. Now, it does come to mind that the Freud or Reich people are kind of advocating this point, right? Regarding this original sexual out of whack pre-Oedipal conundrum. But there could also be I almost said object-oriented ontology. There could be object relations psychoanalysts too that theorize this, although I'm less sure about that. You see, because why? Because he wants to go back and say, no, psychoanalytic treatment is about the isolation of speech and free association to those three operators that we identified before. It's not to this primitive conundrum of a historical point of the intrusion of sexual enjoyment for the subject, even though that does fuck you up as a subject. That's not the end all be all. What do you guys think? Please, Akshay.
I don't know if when, but I mean, a lot of like Laplanche's kind of breakaway is like, for him, he thinks like this out of jointness is also like really vital in some way. But yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know much about why.
Yeah. No, that's okay. Yeah, no, we can hear from Matilda and then we'll continue. Oh no, Connor too, please.
I feel a little confused on this point, but what makes sense to me is for Lacan, perhaps there's like something more like logical genetic account that's going on here. That's like a part of each person, or I didn't even know how to say that, but like seems like what's going on with maybe the ego psychologist or the object-oriented psychologist is like, well, or the Freud Reich people, is like thinking that this that there actually is this experience the subject goes through where like the ideal ego has to be given away and lost. And I feel like he's just trying to say something like, that's a backwards projection that happens like after the fact, in some way. But what I'm confused about is the giving up. Freud seems to account for like the giving up of the ideal ego with the beginnings with like feeling inadequacies from like language and society and kind of this critical consciousness building up in its introduction to language. And this like encounter with the sexual seems different than that. And I'm a bit confused on that point. Like inadequacy through the encounter with the sexual versus inadequacy with the encounter with the social or ego ideal or something.
Yeah. Well, no, the problem is that, yeah, it's obvious that the neurotic will cover over this impossibility. but I think he's just simply talking about the method of treatment of neurosis here, which is that there's no need to go back to make an intervention at this primordial point. It's not going to reorient the signifier or the structure of the neurotic and their investments. It's not going to shake those investments up. So, like, yeah, but I mean, he's going to develop this further, so perhaps it will become more clear. Go ahead, Connor.
Yeah, I think this is kind of like hesitant to describe it like this, but the fate of the subject, right? Because there's two choices being offered here, but the whole twist is that there's no choice, right? Like both of these choices capitulate to a position where you find yourself in a premature position, which is basically like a position of childhood, or a position wherein you were confronted with and compelled to encounter sexuality, right? But you're never like actually able to seize the moment or encounter that present, right? It's encountering an impossibility. So sure, there's two choices here, but basically you end up in the same situation where you're incapable of meeting the moment. And I think this is like I'm hesitant to then say like this is about like the fate of the subject, because this is of course like has to do with revolution, right? And I think what Lacan is basically saying then is that the moment the issue of seizing the moment is always deferred. You're never really like able to confront that, like, which seems pessimistic, but it's a historical question, right? So some moments in history you're just not right, but yeah. So
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, because in that sense, yeah, one could transpose this critique of vulgar Freudianism onto vulgar Marxism. That's kind of what's going on here. There's an implicit homology going on between both, and a lot of it is an implicit critique of their conception of science as a Weltanschauung. That goes back to this notion of the idiocy of bureaucratic socialist intellectuals that Lacan has such a problem with. They would probably theorize capitalism in this vulgar kind of unitary primal scene or something like that. Like, so I don't know, but we have to also keep in mind that we have to keep in mind the merits of homology that he's bringing out regarding our own commitments to Marxism, which can only fully be tested, I think, once we get to seminar 17, regarding the theory of the discourses, in the sense of how capitalism is really theorized to be operating, right? Because in some sense, the subversive figure of the proletariat is not the neurotic, according to Lacan. In some sense, it's a debate between the position of perversion and hysteria. I think it kind of oscillates between those two, in my view. Go ahead, Luis.
I think we have to read, when he talks about revolution, we have to go back to that seminar, that session that we didn't record, when he talks about revolution with capital R, right? Because I think this is crucial, right? It's not just coming back to the same place, but of a revolution that, a different kind of knowledge that he's bringing, right? Because I mean, we can also, this critique is important not to the communist revolution, but to also counter the counter revolution, right? Like all these people that were had hopes of, what was happening outside of the Soviet bloc, right? And they really dare themselves to, destroy, their systems for this new hope, right? When in fact it broke the neoliberal shock, and things were worse than that, right? And yeah, it comes back to that idea, right, of a revolution with capital R that is systematic, right, and not just of an ideal utopia of bringing Jewish sons to work, right? I don't know if you have seen, there is a TV show called Cleo, right, and it's about this from the East, German, what is it? East, the Republic of East Germany. Yeah, whatever. Yeah, and well, spoilers. So if you don't want to hear, just cover your ears. And there's this last part when they confront this guy that he's supposed to be the assassin of the Stasi, right? The spies. And this girl is confronting him, and he says, "Oh, you want to be the working class hero, but you don't know that you're actually being exploited by this and this person, right? So you should give up these hopes." But is that actually a good critique, right? Is that really actually a good critique against communism, right? Of you being controlled by bigger power? Or is these leaders also being exploited, as Lacan is talking right now, right? So we can, we can also use this anti-capitalist, that is lacks systemic, critique to the other side, right? Yeah.
No, that's really interesting. Yeah, that's really good. It's yeah, I mean, in some sense, what Lacan is talking about is this kind of interminable wall of bourgeois individualism, which is blocking solidarity and blocking the sort of movement of the coherence between the dissatisfaction of labor to the achievement of some kind of coherent program for its remediation or for its revolution. Matilda, and then we will go back to Reed.
I'm thinking about the disjunction between knowledge and power, and how like it kind of like became an issue recently, I guess, in kind of Lacan's mind, that like there are problems in the world that like the state can't fix. Like we have knowledge of things, or like we seem to lack power to intervene. And like what's becoming obvious is lack, as like the counting of empire continues. There's like this consistency of lack that kind of like begins to become concrete. And there's also like an inability to do anything about it, but it creates this like desire to jump in to change things. And I think like his conceptions around Weltanschauung and the scientific one is like, he seems to coach a certain patience in regard to this situation that calls for change.
Yeah.
And here, what I'm wondering about here with the capitalist system and the exclusion of jouissance from work is maybe there's like this like maybe there's a ton of knowledge like on a collective level that seems, because like if like if jouissance is excluded, then like maybe like knowledge is developing in a certain way that hadn't happened before. And that it's
Yeah.
power is now like inadequate to the amount of knowledge. And it seems like there's also an account of like reification here about like the worker, how this structures their reality so strongly. Those are just things I was thinking about.
I guess just a question related to that is that at what level then does this kind of is there a demand articulated through some kind of like through this disjunction from like knowledge about a certain situation and any means of using power, I suppose, to put things in a more physics-based term, to go about doing something about it. So at some point there's like a frustrated demand.
Yeah. Right.
I see
Right.
Akshay was raised, please.
Yeah, I mean, like, you know what I mean? Like, there is power, but it's there's like I think Pierre Pasolini kind of line about, I mean, knowledge and power being divided in the sense that, you know, like if you're thinking about corruption and major heads of state, like if you had the knowledge, like everyone knows there's corruption. If you had the evidence, it means you're probably in power, and there's no way you're going to implicate yourself, right? Like it's kind of, but everyone knows that, but you know, but there's again no way to do anything about it.
Right. Yeah, well, it's true. I just want to say one thing. The French author that I mentioned before, Michel Clouscard, makes a strong claim that Lacanianism is only afforded by the structural transformation of the French public sphere through the introduction of the Marshall Plan, which permits a logic of the appearance of the desire economy to have this kind of structural legibility to it. So the funny thing about that is that from a Marxist point of view, I've interviewed somebody who is no slouch when it comes to French theory. Their book is introduced by Catherine Malabou. And he makes the argument that the efficacy of Lacanian thought, precisely through the register of these three terms that he's talking about, the whole idea of structuralism and so on, falls into disrepute in the face of capitalist crises. So you see the point. It's like a really interesting historical materialist analysis on the precondition or on the ground of the legibility and the efficacy of Lacan's whole theory. It's a very compelling argument that Clouscard puts together. Like you could say sort of like yeah, like similar to Habermas's work, his early work on the structural transformation of the public sphere. He does the same thing here from a Marxist lens. And he shows that the philosophers, both Derrida and well, Foucault to some extent, but also Lacan, are only capable of creating this particular apparatus of theory through this materialist transformation in the French civil society. It's a really crazy fucking argument. It's something we hope to get translated soon. And if anyone's interested, you can like send me an email and I can send you like maybe some early translations of it if you want. But okay, if that's of interest, you might reject it. I don't know. Okay. If we are willing to listen, what the neurotic tells us through all of his symptoms, which constitute the locus in which his discourse is situated, is that he seeks solely to be equal to the question that he raises. Whether hysteric or obsessive, I will establish later the link between these two facets of neurosis and objecte as I expounded it in Phobia's Efficacity. The neurotic calls into question the truth of knowledge. He does so precisely because knowledge is attached to jouissance. Is the neurotic right to raise this question anew? Of course he is, since we know that knowledge not only derives its earliest status from its dependence on jouissance, which is what we talked about the paragraph up above, by the way, right? But articulates its distance from it in the course of its development. Okay. That makes sense. That's like, yeah, moving away from the imaginary in some sense. Yet it is not because his discourse is naturally dependent on the truth of knowledge that as I have already explained, it necessarily concerns or falls under this truth. The fact that what he says may be true, or that it is in the right, still does not make legible what, at a certain level, exposes the coherence or constitutive knot by which knowledge depends on the prohibition of jouissance. Right. Yeah, at one point, Lacan says the ethical task of psychoanalytic method is to cut the Gordian knot of this imaginary knot. This because he uses that phrase. Why wouldn't the neurotic constitute a certain form of aporia himself? The kind I showed earlier with the mathematical example. This one. In the form of a stance adopted regarding the impasses that can be formulated as the other's law in sexual matters. After having reviewed as many of the facets distinguishing obsession from hysteria as I could, I would say that in the final analysis, the best formulations that I can provide you of them proceed from what nature offers, from what is natural, as a solution to the impasse of the other's law. For man, insofar as he must identify with the so-called function of the symbolic father, the only function that satisfies, which is why it is mythical, the position of virile jouissance in the sexual encounter, that is what nature offers. This is precisely what is known as quote unquote being the master. This was and still quite adequately remains within a person's grasp. Well, I will say that the obsessive is the one who, in fact, refuses to consider himself a master. Because with regard to what's at stake, the truth of knowledge, what is of concern to him is the relationship between this knowledge and jouissance. What he knows about this knowledge is that he possesses nothing but what remains from the first impact of its prohibition, namely objecte. Jouissance is unthinkable to him except as a treaty with the other, who is always imagined by him to be fundamentally whole. He negotiates with the other. He is authorized to experience jouissance only if he pays over and over again, there being some sort of insatiable Danaides barrel. And you guys remember that reference, right? The women who in the myth of the Roman times were persecuted to a condition of pouring water into a barrel that had holes in it, like the female Sisyphean task, right? This was an account that can never be squared. This is what turns the terms and conditions of debt repayment into the only ceremony in which he encounters his jouissance. That's the obsessive. Okay. 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 Now we're going to talk about hysteria. It is no accident that we find the hysterical form of response to the impasses of jouissance at the other end of the spectrum. Hysteria is characterized by not considering oneself to be the woman or a woman, la femme, which is why we encounter hysteria more often in women. Whereas in this aporia, being the woman, filling that role in the sexual encounter where the hysteric slot is naturally quite fair, is quite regularly open to her, as naturally as it is open to a man. What the hysteric represses, they say, is sexual jouissance. In reality, she promotes or pursues or holds out for herself the point at infinity of jouissance as absolute. She promotes castration at the level of the symbolic name of the father, with regard to which she adopts the stance of wanting to be his ultimate jouissance. And it is because this jouissance cannot be attained that she refuses all others, which, with regard to the absolute relationship that she feels a need to establish, would seem lesser. This is true, moreover, because it is only tangentially related, being solely at the level of adequacy or inadequacy. That takes us back to this point of that primordial condition that all humans experience that Lacan identifies from earlier, and the hysteric kind of remaining within that point of inadequacy. Okay. In light of these terms, I would recommend that you read and reread cases of hysteria, and you will see that they consist of something quite different from anecdotes and from a going around in biographical circles with which the transference, by repeating it, resolves in order to make it easier to deal with, but merely tempers. We undoubtedly strive to calm what we are presented with there by way of an opening or gap, but isn't it essential to locate the mainspring by which it arises? What the neurotic questions anew is nothing other than the border, a border that nothing can infect, suture, that opens up between knowledge and jouissance. By discussion of 1 and small a here was certainly not included at random, and it is not obsolete. This mathematical model is nothing but a sequence of numbers in which, on the sole condition that we write the relationship among them as involving addition, small a as a function links up with the simple repetition of the 1. There is no reason to be surprised by this, for it is the first thing we encounter there. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34. After 2 1s, we have a 2, and we continue on indefinitely. The second one added to the 1 to the 2 makes 3. 3 plus 2 is 5, and after that we have 8, 13, and so on and so forth. This sequence, as I told you, more and more closely approximates the ratio small a as the numbers get bigger. But if we go in the opposite direction, the negative direction, proceeding by subtraction, the same series arrives at a limit. The sequence marked by the ratio small a keeps getting smaller until it arrives, assuming we sum it all up, at a thoroughly finite limit, which can constitute a new point of departure. Let me just finish this section and then we can discuss. What constitutes hysteria can be inscribed in this negative direction, because the hysteric subtracts small a from the absolute 1 of the other, because he or she interrogates it in order to see if it will deliver up the final 1, which would in some sense assure or insure it. With the help of this model, it is easy to demonstrate that the entirety of the hysteric's effort to call small a into question leads, in the process, at best, to the subject being strictly equated with small a and nothing else. That makes sense. This is the drama which, being transposed from the mathematical level where it can be correctly stated to another level, is translated by the irreducible gap of an actual castration. Okay. At the level of statements, a level that I characterized with the term famille, see chapter 18, the impasse created by the hysteric is in fact resolved through the encounter with castration. But there are other possible outcomes at the level of enunciation, which promote the relationship between jouissance and knowledge. Thanks to illustrious historical examples, everyone must know that the solution can be found in a subjective equilibrium on the sole condition that the appropriate tribute is paid by the edifice of a form of knowledge, a knowledge that would like to be knowledge that is corroborated by, or overlapped or intersected by, tried and true knowledge of sexual relations, such as they are perceived only on the basis of the apprehension of the point at infinity, which constitutes an impasse and an aporia, certainly, but which also constitutes a limit. Everyone knows that the same is true for the obsessive. We all know that an entire sector depends on the obsessive's productivity. Even those who are most blind, the most closed off to historical reality, have noticed his contribution to what we call thought. Isn't this also something that expresses its or his limit and must be thoroughly de-exorcised, exorcised? This is the question Freud raised when he talked about the relationship between obsessive rituals and religion. Religions obviously are not exhaustively accounted for by such practices. Pascal's wager is anxiety-provoking precisely because it forces us to see this. Even if we consider things at the level of the promise, even if we turn out to be partisans of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and reject the other to such an extent that we say we don't know whether he is or moreover what he is, it is nevertheless clear that Pascal investigated in his wager in terms of even or odd, of he is or he is not. For indeed, given his era, he was caught up in the questioning of knowledge. And it's on that point that I'll leave you today. Okay. Wow. Okay. Very clear delineations between the aporia for the hysteric versus the obsessive. Yes. It's very, very compelling. Although, how does castration work for the obsessive? I'm not sure if I caught that part exactly, but I'm pretty clear about how it works for the hysteric. Yes, Luis.
I don't know, but I think that in this last statement that of our Pascal, the where he is, it is nevertheless clear that the order that Pascal investigated in the wager is in terms of even or odd, of he is or he is not. And I was thinking that the hysteric, the mechanism of hysteria looks very similar to negative theology, right? It posits the absolute, but it negates any this is not God, right? Negative theology is about describing God by what is not, right? So I guess in this way will be he's not, while the obsessive believes in God, right? In the other. because the
Mm.
hysteric the hysteric, finds enjoyment in bringing the holes in the other, right? While the obsessive does everything possible to maintain the other, right? Uncastrated, right?
I mean, wouldn't that be making the obsessive the pervert? Like sort of in this, like then the obsessive is the defender of the faith who sort of I mean, I don't know what the obsessive is, but I guess like
It's funny that Zizek always says that he's clinically defined as obsessive, right? And if we see, Zizek always repeats the same stuff all the time. All his books are about the same thing, right? And it's all his rituals to maintain, his theory, whatever, I mean, his personal stuff, right? But we can see the logic of the obsessive in there, right? And of course, he as a person, right? As a public figure, you can see that he rejects the master, being the master, right? Yeah, he always rejects being in this master position,
I mean, but I
Hmm.
guess like the paradigmatic figure of like someone who's obsessively following whatever it is, their stamp collection, right? Like uh is that like whereas I feel like a perverse sort of relation would be like Zizek sort of being like, God, I don't want to write more, but I have to feed the people who uh like I mean again, like is that sort of reliance on the other in that sense? So it's sort of sorry, I don't mean to be so like Socratic about it. I'm also just not sure.
Well, if I may respond, well, yeah, that makes sense, right? Because the obsessive is trying to do something it looks like it's filling the void, but well, it is different because for perversion, you're the object, right, what the other wants, right, and you want to fulfill the whole. While the obsessive is not exactly doing what the other needs, right? It's just doing everything possible to avoid, to repress the whole, right? Black. Yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah, this is very helpful. I think that the perverse position is not equivalent to the obsessive position, precisely because the obsessive can handle things like castration, can handle, like in a sense, the pervert relies on the imaginary prop of the other so as to avoid any true confrontation. So they're much more extreme, although there's a lot of overlaps, I think, with the obsessive position. But yeah, I think it's a valid question to see how does obsession actually truly interact with perversion. Maybe Aaron, you have a thought on that, or anything else?
Yeah, I have a few disparate thoughts that I'll try to synthesize. Maybe at the very end of the session where he says, what is this part? Everyone knows that the same is true for the obsessive. We all know that an entire sector depends on the obsessive's productivity. Even those who are most blind, the most closed off to historical reality, have noticed his contribution to what we call thought. Isn't this also something that expresses its or his limit and must be thoroughly de-exercised? So there he mentions thought, and then in the French, that de-exercised, it's desexorciser. So in Spanish, it's desexorcizado. So we could maybe say it in English, desexorcised. So you could hear the sex with the negative prefix. So in the case of the Rat Man, sorry, I'm going to read a little bit more. There's this excerpt in the latter part of the case where he's sort of talking about the theory of it. And he's mentioning how in obsession, thinking comes to replace acting. So here, I'll just read this paragraph. We have already mentioned the important part played by these sadistic instinctual components in the genesis of obsessional neurosis, where the epistemophilic instinct is a preponderant feature in the constitution of an obsessional patient. Brooding becomes the principal symptom of the neurosis. The thought process itself becomes sexualized, for the sexual pleasure which is normally attached to the content of thought becomes shifted onto the act of thinking itself, and the satisfaction derived from reaching the conclusion of a line of thought is experienced as a sexual satisfaction. In the various forms of obsessional neurosis in which the epistemophilic instinct plays a part, its relation to thought processes make it particularly well adapted to attract the energy which is vainly endeavoring to make its way forward into action and divert it into the sphere of thought, where there is a possibility of its obtaining pleasurable satisfaction of another sort. In this way, with the help of the epistemophilic instinct, the substitutive act may in turn be replaced by the preparatory acts of thought. But procrastination in action is soon replaced by lingering over thoughts, and eventually the whole process, together with all its peculiarities, is transferred into a new sphere. Just as in America, an entire house will sometimes be shifted from one site to another. So maybe we could think about the division between hysteria and obsession, between thinking and acting. I don't know. The obsessive will displace I guess that sexual jouissance into compulsive thinking that maybe never finds its conclusion. So that's another reason why he say that the sort of the stamp of obsession will be doubt, like brooding. And I mean, maybe Hamlet is like the obsessive par excellence.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think the neurotic, the obsessive, and the hysteric like are really distinct from one another, because of how they relate to knowledge. I think that's kind of like a bit like the basic thing that's going on. So for the neurotic, like I think it's helpful to, like Aaron was just saying, to think of it in terms of like, what are you gonna do? You know, the problem for the neurotic is I know all of these things, but what am I gonna do with this knowledge? You know, they're kind of like handicapped by knowing so much, kind of a Nietzschean point, if that's your thing. But the obsessive like doesn't, you know, they just accept this knowledge and accept the demands that knowledge and the other places on them and just acts. You know, this is why like for the obsessive, it's not a question of thinking. This is like how I understand it, right? Because they just sort of like meet the demands, and uncritically, self-reflectively. And for the hysteric, it's more a question of like, who says I'm supposed to do what? You know, like you think you know what's good for me. That's sort of attitude. But no, more seriously, like you know, that's how I'm thinking of it. But what does this have to do with utopia? You know what I'm saying? And it's of course the hysteric that I think is going to illuminate that question for us, and especially I'm thinking of towards the bottom of 290. Let's see. She promotes the point at infinity of jouissance. I'm sorry. She promotes castration at the level of the symbolic name of the father, with regard to which she adopts the sense of wanting to be his ultimate jouissance. Interesting. And it is because this jouissance cannot be attained that she refuses all others, which, with regard to the absolute relationship that she feels a need to establish, would seem lesser. Where is she establishing this? This is true, moreover, because it is only tangentially related, being solely at the level of adequacy or inadequacy. And if we'll remember, this question of revolution earlier was dealing with capitalism trying to convince you that you were always going to be inadequate to rise to the moment. And basically, it seems as though the hysteric is trying to stake out a position somewhere, we might say nowhere, where this question of adequacy or inadequacy can be discussed, contemplated, and so on. So that's where I'm kind of like going towards. But again, if we started this reading talking about utopia, like, where are we right now? So
yeah, that's very fascinating, especially if capitalism makes the problem of the name of if capitalism, as Lacan will later suggest, sort of modifies and also intensifies the problem of the name of the father, then yeah, from what model is the hysteric's dissatisfaction about pleasing the master going to come from? Some sense. That's an interesting question that I think a lot of Lacanian thought has had to wrestle with, and a lot of leftists who you could associate with counterculture, reparative, Kleinian thought in particular, will of course chastise the Lacanian field precisely for that presupposition to some figure of mastery and so on, right? Even though the hysteric already renders that figure of mastery as already inadequate or throws it into suspense, like you're saying, Connor. And then, of course, the other question would be, can one think about the figure of mastery as like the system, right? Why do we have to personalize? Because that's another big theme that Lacan is talking about, is don't personalize, right? And of course, it would make no sense to do that as a revolutionary. It would be like the most vulgar thing to do, right? Yeah, this is pretty good stuff. Yeah. Okay, Luis.
So to go back to perversion and neurosis, right? So then the pervert regresses back to this anaclitic stage, right? While the neurotic accepts the phallic stage, right? Castration, but I mean goes through the castration, but cannot fully, accept it, right? Especially on the desire of the other, right? So that's why we have the gaze and the voice, because the pervert stays with, the anus, the oral drive, while the other objects are about desire, right? Because the obsessive method of defense against the whole in the other is by fulfilling the demand of the other, right? So I don't want to know the desire of the other. I don't know that. I don't want to know the fact that I don't know the desire of the other by setting a demand and trying to fulfill it, right? But the funny thing about hysteria, right, is why is the hysteric so obsessed with bringing the holes in the other, right? I think it's because the hysteric presupposes that the master, the other, is complete, right? And she expects it not to be complete, right? Well, why will you find pleasure in bringing holes if you know that the other is incomplete, right? Yeah, because the hysteric is the closest one to subjectivity, yet it's still a variation of the master discourse, right? It's supposed to be the most neutral one.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, because it's almost like the hysteric has the closest proximity to the object A, and they are the ones that are kind of like the arbiters of it in some sense. That that has a certain political valence into uh yeah into the not only the deterioration of mastery, but also the possible recomposition of it as well, but also to into the fictional basis of equality itself. I'm even thinking here of Rancier's wonderful text on the ignorant schoolmaster, and that whole argument about uh, enlightenment presuppositions to equality as uh, containing an authority structure which is that partitions whole regimes of aesthetic reality uh, that ultimately block and foreclose certain subjects from participating in them. Well, if that's true, then it would be hysterical subjects that could mediate, like, that could show the holes uh, in regimes of knowledge. To go to Connor's point, to reveal the yeah, because like if the obsessive is content with the repetition of the Danaids, the hysteric's not. That's powerful. So yeah, I mean, I'm putting my money on the hysteric here if we're talking revolution and the worker, because there's not going to be. Can you think of an obsessive revolutionary? Maybe insofar as you need, but they're not a figure of leader.
That will be the, this new communist party, the MAGA communists. They're very obsessive about it, and
That's very true.
they have a plan of what to do, and repetitious religious.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. No, and their insistence on their whole theory of like normality is highly obsessive. Their position is basically that the working class, their position is that we demand that the working class remain obsessives in some sense, right? But it kind of doesn't. Well, then they rely and fetishize a other uh, that makes the initiation process function. But frankly, most of that sounds to me more perverse than it does obsessional, precisely because the identifications and reliance on that leader are, yeah, well, I mean, I don't know. Lacan says right there that the other is taken as to be whole. That's definitely what these guys do with their leaders. Anyways, okay, we should probably stop talking about that. Matilda, go ahead.
I was thinking of the neurotics as symptomatic of something. They kind of like, he says that they call into question the truth of knowledge. They do so because knowledge is attached to jouissance. But that, what they say is true, but it still does not make legible or exposes the coherence or constitutive not by which knowledge depends on the prohibition of jouissance. Like they don't go far enough, perhaps, or something at making sense of this juncture between knowledge and jouissance.
Yeah, it's almost like the neurotic hasn't overcome that imaginary knot of the intrusion of sexual jouissance that riddles all subjects in some sense. Like they haven't worked through the problem of that constitutive thing, which is why the problems that they pose will always be in the measure of themselves. They pose problems that only they know they can solve in that sense, because they don't have another that they're challenging or that they necessarily rely on in the same way as the obsessive or as the hysteric.
Was gonna add on top of that this procedure that he's talking about initially with the image of the natural numbers and like the transfinite number aleph, and then what he was saying that was related to this procedure of dealing with aporias, or what seem like irrational numbers, reminds me a little bit of like he has a procedure to work with these irrationalities by symbolizing them or excluding them from the system and symbolizing them or something. The neurotics, they're questioning 1 and A, like they have this relationship with 1 and A, like the hysteric is the 1 minus A, the decreasing sum, he says. And that's like the image of those semicircles flipping over.
Mm.
And it's like the hysteric continues flipping in the hopes of realizing that sum so that they can measure themselves against the 1 of jouissance. And I think Lacan's saying it's a hopeless endeavor that they're on in some way. And that he knows how to like deal with these irrationalities that these people are encountering, these aporias. And like I'm saying, he has this procedure to somehow rationalize them, in fact. And it kind of is like almost like these neurotics are stuck in an irrationalist position. Like perhaps they are like hypostasizing the problem of the irrational thing. Like I'm thinking in Lukash's sense there. But because anyway, it's kind of a speculative idea, but I mean, Hegel is brought up in that text as like encountering irrationality in the realm of numbers, as like the first time he brings into question, or he starts to use the term irrationality. And he has a procedure of dealing with irrationalities in a way. I'm just kind of,
that's really helpful that the far right depiction would, because I guess the neurotic is the worst off of the lot, because for them the relationship between the 1 and the A is kind of defunct. Doesn't seem like, you know what I mean? Like at least the obsessive can get to work and can produce, and the hysteric can embody the object A, and you know what I mean? Like there's certain, like but neurosis seems to me much more dire or much more set adrift. Let's do Luis, and then we probably should close after this comment.
So I mean, just what you said, neurosis. I mean, Lacan talks, I'm not sure, but neurosis also includes obsession and hysteria. So I don't.
Yeah, that's
know.
true. Well, that's true, but isn't it also that's true that they bleed over? But isn't it also true that he's pinpointing a form of neurosis that would be of its own or something like I don't know? Or are you saying that they are only thought as like these two variations?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a question. Yeah.
That's a question, yeah.
Yeah. But what I was trying to say, what I wanted to say is that in topic of the hysteric, right? Isn't the hysteric like, I mean, thinking the hysteric as the revolutionary, but isn't the hysteric exactly the like the constructivist, right? This, you know, this trend, postmodernist trend saying, oh, this is not, you know, this is not the revolution, this is not, you know, the utopian whatever, right? Like the Simon Critchley has this book, The Infinitely Demanding, right? And it exactly comes to this notion of the hysteric, like infinitively demanding. Of course, this is not, right? So yeah, I don't think there is exactly one particular you know, type that is closer to a revolutionary, you know.
Yeah, maybe not. Maybe not, but maybe it's useful to, well, Lacan is encouraging us to put them into some kind of discussion, obviously. So, yes, this is incredibly rich. How many sessions do we have left so we can gauge our time? Let's see. So we have 1, 2, and 3, 4. Yeah, we have 4 sessions left. So that's good. Yeah, next Tuesday may be difficult, but I will communicate on Discord my plans, and we'll figure it out from there. But very nice session. Very, very, very helpful. Really enjoyed it, everyone. And yeah, let's be in touch on Discord then. All the best. Peace out. Thanks, guys.